So we can't talk about government efficiency without talking about taxes. There are politicians, accountants, and business leaders on both sides of the aisle debating whether to lower or raise taxes, but we at Kiss My Tech are not ready to put a dog in that fight. One thing that is clear, regardless of some people who are deluded enough to think that federal income tax could be abolished, that is not in the realm of reality, at least not within the foreseeable future. Even if that somehow happened, there'd still be state or other taxes that would need to be collected. Furthermore, if there were no federal income tax, it's highly likely that the states would increase their taxes in order to pay the federal government to fund the military and national security, etc. You know the old saying, the only certainties in life are death and taxes. So we'll leave it to the powers that be to duke it out on how much taxes to collect, along with the deductions, deferments, and depreciation. Yeah, we know policing taxes is a prime objective of the DOGE musketeers, but let's talk about some preventative measures and catching issues early by taking every step possible to stop fraud before it happens. So let's DOGE right into the dreaded tax arena. However, we're going to look at the efficiency of how we pay taxes and on what basis we pay taxes. Yes, we at Kiss My Tech upgraded the goal to include effectiveness. So, what if preparing and calculating your taxes didn't have to cost you so much, both financially and yes, emotionally? And what if that could somehow benefit the government at the same time? By the way, the idea of good mental health for Americans should be a bipartisan focus, not something that just dies with the woke movement. But we'll show you the money first. Hold on to your hats, folks, because we're going big. Try not to drown in the numbers. This is an excerpt from a post on the website for the Tax Foundation dated August 6, 2024. According to the latest estimates from the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, Americans will spend more than 7.9 billion hours complying with IRS tax filing and reporting requirements in 2024. This is equal to 3.8 million full-time workers doing nothing but tax return paperwork, roughly equal to the population of Los Angeles and nearly 46 times the workforce at the IRS. If we assume a reasonable hourly wage, the 7.9 billion hours Americans spend complying with the tax code costs the economy roughly $413 billion in lost productivity. In addition, the IRS estimates that Americans spend roughly $133 billion annually in out-of-pocket costs to comply with the tax code. This brings the total compliance costs to $546 billion, or nearly 2% of the GDP. And to remind everyone, the GDP is gross domestic product. Hello, folks. So just on a top level, that is glaringly, blindingly inefficient and ineffective. It's almost overwhelming to imagine that total compliance cost $546 billion, $500 billion. And that is just for the privilege of preparing the taxes, which doesn't even count the money Americans actually spend paying their taxes. And that's before we even get into non-compliance, tax mistakes, and the F word, as in fraud. In a February 22, 2024 interview on CNBC, Tax Commissioner Danny Werfel shared the following. Now, since the interview was over 30 minutes long, we're going to paraphrase the key points without losing context. Commissioner Danny Werfel told CNBC that previously the IRS did not have the budget to hold the taxpayers who are non-compliant accountable. He went on to say the IRS, with billions of dollars in new funding from Congress, has launched a sweeping crackdown on wealthy individuals, partnerships, and large companies. Now, we also learned from his interview they are making significant investments into AI that is not only programmed with the super complicated tax code, but it utilizes existing databases that are publicly accessible to do everything from tracking corporate travel, including private plane usage, to flagging discrepancies between what companies put in their tax returns versus the earnings these companies disclose through reports and online publications. Also, during the interview, Commissioner Workle said the IRS has put millionaires and billionaires who are delinquent on their taxes on notice and created a high-risk list of more than 1,600 millionaires and billionaires that have unpaid taxes, totaling more than 150 billion in delinquent taxes per year. He also commented that they are now uncovering money that is being inappropriately shielded, unraveling the complexity of pass-throughs, money in multiple currencies, and tracking money through subsidiaries. I gotta say, the IRS is definitely taking a step in the right direction by developing AI that is up to the task. He went on to say, we have to make investments to make sure that whether you're a complicated filer who can't afford to hire an army of lawyers and accountants, or a simpler filer who has one income and takes the standard deduction, the IRS is equally able to determine what's owed. I will say he did seem in earnest that he wanted to restore trust between the American people and the IRS. However, I'm afraid his walk doesn't totally match his talk. You'll see what I'm referring to when we highlight some of the human resource problems within the IRS. Moving on, per the IRS website on September 13th, 2024, in the fiscal year of 2022, IRS criminal investigation initiated more than 2,550 criminal investigations, identified over 31 billion from tax and financial crimes, and obtained a 90.6% conviction rate on cases accepted for prosecution. Okay, so let's take a minute to digest this. The report was in September 2024, but the statistics are regarding crimes that were at least 2 years old. Also, let's note that they got convictions on whatever number of cases were actually accepted for prosecution, but they did not disclose how much money was recovered based on those specific convictions, as in money owed to the government. So it's great for those criminals to be punished, but it's not really a win for the American people, since it costs taxpayers money to investigate and prosecute these people, but it doesn't actually put money back into the government. Obviously, punishing and deterring criminals is critical, but I can't help but think there could be more emphasis on preventing this from happening and minimizing the opportunity for unpaid taxes, accidentally or on purpose. Moving on, here's a report about monies recovered by the IRS. Not sure if it's connected, but let's give it a look-see. Once again, according to the IRS website in a report dated December 5th, 2024, the agency's investigative work identified over $9.1 billion in fraud from tax and financial crimes, obtained court orders totaling $1.7 billion in restitution to the IRS, and seized criminal assets totaling approximately $1.2 billion. Now, hold on. Wait a minute. So this report is not talking about the $150 billion in delinquent taxes from the millionaires and billionaires. It's talking about actual tax fraud and financial crimes. So on the good side, it seems to be down from the $31 billion in 2022, although that's not clear. But let's take a minute to digest what this report is really saying. The IRS investigators discovered $9.1 billion in fraud, as in $9.1 billion of money that was missing, technically owed to the government but not paid. Right, got that. So the IRS obtained court orders and managed to get a whopping $1.7 billion in restitution and seized criminal assets totaling approximately $1.2 billion. So that totals $2.9 billion, meaning that only roughly 32% of the money owed was recovered. Yeah, with the power of the United States government on their side, the IRS was only able to recover less than a third of what was owed. And that doesn't seem so great. There was no report as to how much it cost the IRS to recover this money, such as staff cost, legal cost, etc. Come on now. Obtaining court orders doesn't come cheap. So when it's all balanced out, based on a super wild-ass guess, we estimate after cost, it's likely the government only collected a net gain of $1.5 billion, and that's on the high side. Okay, so the fact that there are billions of dollars in tax fraud is not new. Even the fact that millionaires and billionaires hire teams of lawyers to find ways to cut taxes is not new. However, I was a bit taken back to hear that these millionaires and billionaires have acknowledged and agreed to the fact that they owe $150 billion, but somehow the IRS didn't have the resources to freeze their bank accounts. But let's not get stuck on things in the past, let's move forward. The fact that the tax code is extraordinarily complex is also not new and creates a recipe for mistakes at best and tons of opportunity to hide fraud if the taxpayer is so inclined. Let's face it, who doesn't try to milk those deductions for all they're worth? And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a fine line. And when that line is crossed, the trouble begins for the taxpayers, regardless of who they are. But here's a bit of an eye-opening situation. Out of the 85,359 IRS employees, 3,323 had not fully paid the balances of their own personal taxes, amounting to an estimated $5 million. Per the Washington Examiner, only 20 of the 70 employees that were willfully evading taxes were fired. Therefore, the other 3,253 IRS employees who had unpaid taxes were just negligent or incompetent. I gotta say, the amount of unpaid taxes by the IRS's own employees surprised me a lot. And the fact that they only get fired for not paying taxes when the rest of us taxpayers face heavy fines and incarceration really shocked me. Well, if that's not the wolves guarding the henhouse, I don't know what is. So it couldn't be more clear that from beginning to end, from preparation to collection, to tax evasion, intentionally or unintentionally, we're talking about a monumental problem, like a Mount Everest-sized problem. So that requires big tech solutions. It makes total sense that the IRS would develop AI and upgrade their existing systems in order to be able to handle more complex cases more efficiently, check the calculations on those tax returns, and track what they call non-compliance. I really don't think when President Abraham Lincoln instituted the permanent tax system, he intended citizens to have to work so hard to pay taxes and pay so much to have their tax filings prepared after working so hard to make the money that is being taxed. Sure, for ordinary folk, there are simple returns, but often those tax returns aren't as accurate or as fair as they could be. And since they affect the lower income earners, every penny counts. Another thing that was highlighted in that CNBC interview was that most of the money they actually do recover from non-compliant taxpayers actually came from people earning under $200,000 a year. Why not start with cutting out the middleman, as in all the middlemen, thereby saving taxpayers money on preparing their tax filings, regardless of what the latest and greatest tax strategy is? Let it go a step further and reimagine how we pay taxes. So here's our idea for DOGE. It's multifaceted like a diamond, and you probably already guessed the first facet. Why not make the AI being developed by the IRS available to all taxpayers to use in order to prepare their taxes? Yes, that means the tax filings would be prepared properly in the first place with way less out-of-pocket cost. Yeah, their AI would need to be upgraded to include calculating state and local taxes if applicable, plus the system would need to be scoped to accommodate hundreds of millions of users. That's cumbersome, but it's doable. Although the IRS is already taking the ball halfway across the field with their current AI development, let's take it all the way to the finish line. If you're even going to try to say that the tax law, including state and local tax, is just too complex to provide an accurate tool for taxpayers, come on now. Do you have any idea how many calculations are required in order to perform a computer-aided eye surgery in real time for each individual eyeball? Opticians have been doing LASIK for years. The government is spending billions of dollars of our tax money to build a system to check our taxes to find errors. Why not let us use a version of that system to pay the taxes to start with? Almost all the errors would be avoided, and quite frankly, a system like that would make it harder on those tempted to fiddle a little with their taxes or fiddle a lot. The system could even incorporate strategies and analysis from top accountants to make sure people aren't overpaying or underpaying. Think about it. It's like a 2-for-1. It would go a long way to fixing the problems in advance of them happening and saving hundreds of billions of dollars for the American people. Revolutionary! Just imagine, taxpayers would be able to save billions of dollars on preparing their taxes. But more than that, it would empower taxpayers to more accurately prepare their taxes, thus avoiding mistakes. We can even call it the Tax Anxiety Reduction Act. The AI could assist taxpayers every step of the way with an interactive, regenerative interface. It's easy to see that this would restrict the opportunities for the taxpayers to commit fraud, thereby reducing the budget needed by the IRS to chase those that are non-compliant or fraudulent. Taxpayers would have the opportunity to update their information and deductions in real time. The interface could even have breadcrumbs, the string of words that shows you the data trail that led to those results. The taxpayer could also be given a list of tax laws that were incorporated into each calculation. Okay, now let's all put on our big boy pants and get corporate. We all know large companies and corporations employ armies of lawyers and accountants dedicated to the sole mission of trying to cut their taxes. Based on having a corporate version of the IRS's AI to prepare their taxes, those companies would save money because they wouldn't need that army. A small team could use the taxpayer AI for corporations to calculate their taxes correctly. Now, they would pay a bit more in taxes because they wouldn't be able to fudge, but that is still a fraction of the accounting and legal cost of being audited. So their risk factor would be dramatically reduced. Of course, in simple terms, this system could interface with a company's existing accounting system, including bells and whistles like a special interface for credit card statements to delineate personal expenses from company expenses, as well as tying into the company's expense reports. So companies would still need an accounting department, but save money on the tax side. Granted, it would be a bit more complicated than that to scope and implement, but let's not get bogged down in the detail. Moving on. That is only one facet of this idea for DOGE. We propose to bring the entire tax system into the 21st century. Ask yourself, why are we paying estimated taxes and then recalculating taxes on a yearly basis? Come on, that is not only a step behind current AI capabilities, but doing it the way it's always been done adds to the government's cost of calculating, collecting, recalculating, and refunding taxes. Does that not seem incredibly antiquated? So why not restructure the tax code to collect taxes dynamically or even monthly? For example, taxpayers could have taxes deducted every time money is deposited into their accounts. All of the taxpayers' deductions could be calculated in real time and then be paid via ACH. For more complex tax filings, businesses and corporate taxes, they could be calculated and paid monthly. The government could still get its pound of flesh from each taxpayer and have wildly complicated tax codes as they do now, but the AI would do the heavy lifting. In fact, it's likely that if the government actually cut taxes, the IRS would still yield more money based on the new system. The IRS would be streamlined, save money on administration and compliance, and spend far less to chase non-payment. But another critical facet of this DOGE idea is that each taxpayer's data would remain stored locally on their own computers or in their clouds. They could create their tax profile using the online MasterTax AI and then download their personalized AI to calculate their own taxes on an ongoing basis. The system can notify them of updates in tax codes, etc., in the same way Microsoft Office does. So, taxpayers could download an update to their own personalized tax AI. Their AI could also apply the appropriate tax credits and calculate deferments, etc. In theory, for independent contractors and self-employed people, their AI would prompt them to launch a filing once a month on a designated date to best accommodate their accounts receivables. For monthly filings, it could be as easy as the taxpayer to use their personalized tax AI to calculate their tax payment, and then only the data relevant to their taxes is uploaded through a secure link. On the other hand, the taxpayer could choose to pay dynamically every time they receive money. But all taxpayers would get a one-time password every time they pay taxes dynamically, produced to add an extra layer of data security. However, the government would not maintain a link into the taxpayer system, thereby preserving their privacy. Once again, we at Kiss My Tech are anti-cookies. So of course, our DOGE ideas involve no cookies taking your data, crawling around your digital life, and no data mining. For people that work at companies, instead of the company paying estimated taxes for the employee out of each paycheck, they would just pay the taxes for the employee based on the information provided by that employee. Almost exactly the same way it happens now. But the employee would save money each paycheck instead of playing the tax refund game. And instead of having to file taxes at the end of the year, they would just receive monthly statements and be prompted to report extra earnings. If somehow the taxes weren't paid after 60 days, it would be straightforward to program the system to trigger a pre-audit notification. Then, if ignored, the situation would escalate from there. So the problem of unpaid taxes would never go on for years. It would be caught much, much sooner and therefore acted upon. The cost to the IRS would infinitely be cheaper and therefore save taxpayers money. So this is the point in our presentation of totally unique, out-of-the-box ideas when we take some super wild-ass guesses as to how much it would cost to implement and how much it would save. So here goes. We have no idea how far into their development the IRS has gotten on their AI system, nor do we have any real idea of their scope. However, we do know the system is designed for internal use, not for public use with millions of simultaneous hits to the server. Not to mention, based on our vision for personalized tax AIs, there would need to be some R&D on the unique functionality. So we would still surmise that this could be done in an efficient way by simply adding to their existing development team. Therefore, we're going to make a super wild-ass guess and say it would cost on the high side $100 million on top of what they're currently spending. Once again, there is existing building space that could be allocated to save on cost for workspace. But most importantly, there is an existing framework in place, as in there is already enterprise-level development happening on the AI itself, programming the incredibly complex and cumbersome tax code, as well as a management platform and the ability to run individual use cases. Now that said, once again, our shot in the dark is based on a more efficient startup strategy for development, utilizing agile teams with a low burn rate, not a bloated government operation. We are also going to allocate a hypothetical budget of $25 million for taxpayer education, tutorials, and a helpline. So the only losers in this deal are all those people who make their living by preparing taxes and software companies like TurboTax that make money off the taxpayers. But time moves on and innovation must be allowed to happen. It's a fact of life that some companies lose their relevance. Does anyone remember the Blockbuster video or a device called a Palm Pilot that was all the rage in the late 1990s? The bottom line is the need for companies to stay in business should never be more of a priority than the needs of the American people. And since implementing, and this is a ginormous what if, and even if some form of it were to be adopted, those people and companies would have a few years to reinvent themselves because one thing is for sure, it wouldn't happen overnight. So we project that based on a $125 million investment, the IRS could collect at least $120 billion out of the $150 billion of that uncollected tax money from millionaires and billionaires and reduce tax fraud and non-compliance by 80%, resulting in a net gain of at least, we'll say, $20 billion. So the subtotal of the net gain from this dynamic tax AI DOGE idea is a net gain of $144.875 billion. But now we get to add in the whopper savings based on the whopper amount of money wasted in preparing taxes the old-fashioned way. You know, the $546 billion we discussed at the beginning. So we're going to estimate that whopper of waste would be reduced by at least 90%, saving the American taxpayer roughly $419 billion. Yes, I said billion. Then once we add in the subtotal of the $145 billion, implementing this new AI system that would calculate each taxpayer's taxes dynamically or monthly and paid via ACH would yield a combined total of at least $564 billion, over $0.5 trillion, which consists of money saved by each and every taxpayer, increased tax revenue paid to the government, and money put back into the U.S. economy, and all of that is without even raising taxes. We hope you've enjoyed this totally unique, out-of-the-box idea. If you found it thought-provoking, please hit the like button, let us know what you thought, and feel free to share it around. You are cordially invited back to Doge it out again. Bye for now, and don't forget to kiss my tech.